Hey, Mr. 2 Star Wars Nerds here. Welcome to my journey into the EU. I'm excited to talk about this comic book series, Boba Fett, Enemy of the Empire. And in particular, I'm excited to talk about one scene where Boba Fett headshots Darth Vader. I thought this was quite a bit of fun. It's kind of weird, to be honest, but I love Boba Fett, and so this was super cool. So just so you know, there is probably going to be a lot of spoilers here, but I want to keep this short and just share my thoughts. The whole point of this series is really getting into the EU for myself. I've read a lot about the EU and I've watched a lot, but this is my journey into it for myself. So basically the 5,000 foot overview of this comic series is you have Darth Vader, who has hired Boba Fett to retrieve this casket that is being held by this military officer, Carta. And there's a lot of mystery in the beginning about what's actually in this casket, but all you know is that Vader is very adamant about Boba not opening this casket at all. His job is to capture it and to deliver it to him. But then you find out that Vader has actually hired assassins to follow Boba around, and once he has a casket, to kill Boba, take the casket back to Vader, and then Vader's going to kill them. So you see Vader is very, very intense about wanting this casket and making sure that its contents stay secret. So it feels like a MacGuffin for a while, this casket, just because it's like, why does Vader care so much about this thing? And what you end up finding out is that this military commander, Carta, he led this mission to slaughter the native Ikari, and there's a lone survivor who was the Ikari leader, and she was a precog, so she could tell the future, and it would just kind of come to her. It's a strange gift, like through the Force, that she'd be able to tell the future, and that she had also weaved the entire wealth of her tribe into her hair, like weaved gold and precious metal into her hair. So yes, her hair was valuable, but her precog abilities were so much more valuable because she could say what your future was. And you know, this whole idea of maybe I can change my future. And so Vader was very, very intent on wanting to get this casket because her head, her severed head, was actually in this casket, and somehow it's still like alive and she's able to still be a precog decapitated. It's kind of strange, to be honest. But what ends up happening is Boba is going on this sleuthing mission as a bounty hunter to try and find Carta, and the whole time there's just a bunch of Boba action. You know, he's killing a Wookiee here, he's fighting people over here, he kills one of the assassins in a photo booth, all of this stuff. He ends up making it to the planet that Carta found himself on, that we were introduced to in the beginning of the first issue of this series. And he makes it to Marix Minor, and this whole huge action sequence starts kicking up where there's the pessimists, who this is the monastery that Carta is hiding out on, and Boba is going to get Carta. He's going to get him, he's going to kill him. Really cool action, and this is where I do get a little bias. I had fun, but it's because I love Boba. I love seeing him in comic book form. It was super cool. You get to see his gadgets in action. He's taking care of the assassins. He's taking care of Carta, all of this stuff. But then at the same time, you find out that Vader has made it to Marix Minor as well. And so you're starting to see this escalation happening where it's like, okay, Boba and Vader are eventually going to meet. So what ends up happening, Boba ends up killing Carta. He takes the casket, and then the story of how this precog's head ended up in the casket is told to Boba, and basically she's like, hey, do you want to know your future? You know, all of this, and Boba is resisting, but then we get this awesome scene. This is my favorite part of this whole comic. Boba versus Darth Vader. Vader shows up and is basically like, hey, like, I know you dealt with Carta. You need to give me what's mine. And Boba basically opened fires and is like, forget that. And Vader starts deflecting the blaster bolts from Boba's weapon, and then you have a thermal detonator thrown at Vader. All of this really awesome stuff. And then Vader just starts, you know, pulling out his lightsaber, starts going to work. Boba even fires a rocket right at Vader. All of this cool stuff. My favorite thing, though, favorite thing in this whole thing, in this whole comic, is when Boba Fett, with the casket in hand, is at the edge of this cliffside, about to fall into the lava, and he falls back off of the cliff, and boom, right here, take a look at it, headshots Vader. He thinks he killed him. He thinks he won. Vader ends up using the Force, though, and obviously we know Vader doesn't die. Vader uses the Force, though, pulls Boba's weapon away from him, and kind of as a last act of defense, Boba kicks the casket down into the lava, and Vader uses the Force to capture it. All of this stuff happens, and Boba escapes. Vader leaves with his casket, and then he destroys the pessimist monastery because he's mad. And so all these pessimists who were like, hey, we're finally free, Vader just kills them all, just blows up their whole monastery from his Star Destroyer. So I felt like that was like pretty good, you know, for Vader. Then you get into this whole thing with Vader and the precog head, where you see like basically one thing that could happen to Vader is that he can become a slave to Palpatine forever, or the other side is that he basically succeeds and he kills Palpatine, and it's a pretty brutal, like he cuts him in half. And so it's basically like, hey, you can kind of have whatever happened to you. And, you know, Vader takes it for what it is, and he just decides to kill this precog, to Force crush her head, because he doesn't want that knowledge falling into the hands of the Emperor. But then, after this Darth Vader tangent, what I think is so cool is at the end there's this recap as Boba's flying away in the Slave One. There's this recap where he's thinking, man, I could have killed Vader. Right? He was on the edge. I could have killed him. But what he does is he holds out his hands, and you see that he has the hair of the Ikari leader woven with wealth in his hands. And so for me, that's classic Boba. He's like, you know what? I got my payment. I got what I wanted. If I'm gonna rank this one, you know, I would say that this sits up there pretty high for me for Boba. I think this was a lot of fun. There's the action. There's a weird story surrounding it. If it wasn't Boba, I wouldn't be too hype about it. But Boba Fett is one of my favorites, so I'm gonna give into the bias. But yeah, let me know in the comments if you have read this comic, how you liked it, what you think. Do you think this is classic Boba? This is a great comic in my opinion. So with that, thanks for hanging out with me on this journey into the EU. I'm Mr. 2 Star Wars Nerds. May the Force be with you always.